Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Ryan. So we're really fortunate to have a student moderator from Pride Student Union, Starlina James. Starlina is a senior at FSU and uses they, them pronouns. They are majoring in retail entrepreneurship and one of PSU's programming coordinators. Starlina, we're thrilled to have you. You have the floor.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I will soon be a Pride alumni, which is really exciting. I'm super excited to graduate soon. I will be giving a quick introduction to Dr. Upchurch. Charles Upchurch is an associate professor of British history at Florida State University. He received his PhD from Rutgers University in 2003, and his research focuses on 19th century British gender history, social and cultural history, and the history of sexuality. His latest book, Beyond the Law, The Politics of Ending the Death Penalty for Sodomy in Britain, published in 2021 by Temple University Press, investigates men who worked to reduce penalties for sex between men in the first half of the 19th century, culminating in a previously unknown series of parliamentary debates in 1840 and 1841. Some of the individuals involved were prominent writers, some were politicians, and some spoke of same-sex attraction as a natural, as written in their character since birth. The book tells the story of these men's political actions and the familial and social networks that made these actions possible. His previous book, Before Wild, Sex Between Men in Britain's Age of Reform, explores ways in which class influenced the interpolation of same-sex desire between 1820 and 1870, placing family reactions at the center of the narrative in order to better understand how these acts were thought of within the broader culture. Since 2014, he has served as a distinguished academic patron of LGBT History Month in the United Kingdom. He was a scholar in residence at the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and he currently serves as the president of the Southern Conference on British Studies. And I will hand it over to Dr. Upchurch. Super happy to be here and super excited to listen to him speak. Have a good day, everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Starlina. Very excited to be here. Let me just get the share screen set up. And okay, so everyone should be able to see my slideshow at this point. And so I would also very much like to thank the FSU Pride Alumni Network for inviting me here to speak tonight. I'm really excited about being able to share some of the thoughts that I had on this topic, right? Because the group asked me, right, to talk about Florida queer history. But I was also given a question early on, right? Someone asked, because it's also, right, Black History Month. And would there be people of color in the talk as well too? And that really sort of led me towards meditations on how we write history and how the history has been written over the years, the ways in which people of color had been left out of previous queer histories, the ways in which others have worked to include people of color and reincorporate them back into the story where they always were. And so that's going to be a theme that we're going through tonight, right? Although, oh, and one of the things too that's going to really kind of define this talk is that I put the books up that I draw on so that as I'm talking on my slides, if you want more information, if you want to get like more in depth in something that I'm speaking about, do a screenshot, right? Or a screen capture so that you can get the title and read a little bit more, right? So, and I usually like to start by just saying that one of the reasons why I became a historian and a queer historian is that growing up in the South, right, in a very homophobic environment, I always thought that history gave some of the best answers to the perennial criticisms that I always faced, right? That it's always been this way, that queerness is against religion or it's against family. And in fact, though, when you look at the history of it all, it's modern homophobia that's really unique in world history. There are great varieties in gender and sexuality and gender presentation throughout cultures in the past. And that it's really what we think of as modern homophobia really begins in the late 17th century forward in Western Europe and spreads outward, right? So history is kind of liberating in that way to know just how particular our, configuration is. Now, when we zoom in from the world to Florida specifically, there are some key themes that we're going to talk about that sort of help to define queer history within Florida specifically, right? Ideas of transgression and the tropics, right? But also because we're in the southern United States. So thinking about the mechanisms of white supremacy and the policing of those cultural forms and the ways in which that it affects queer expression and queer desire. The Gay Liberation Front, right? Religious conservatism, all of these themes are going to be mixed in and interwoven with our talk. So we're going to progress in two parts. Part one is going to be built around the idea that queer history came late to Florida and that is a really good thing, right? The definitive queer history of Florida was just written in the past few years. And so we're going to take a look at that and why it was good that it kind of came late in the process. Then part two is going to be about how do we take the insights from reviewing the historiography of how queer history has been written over the past 40 years and apply them to our experience here at Florida State University, right? We're going to be about halfway through the talk before we get to FSU, but that's okay, I think, because we need that contextualization in order to understand what we're looking at. Although that said, we don't have to wait that long to get to our first FSU alum in the talk, because this is really not known that well on campus. But one of the very first people to do a PhD in LGBTQ history was Richter Norton, who did it in the English department here at Florida State University. Richter Norton did his dissertation on Renaissance homosexuality. He also taught some of the first gay and lesbian history courses and literature courses in the nation at Florida State University. He was active in the Gay Liberation Front here. And his work, what he's most known for is Mother Clap Smiley House, right? Because one of the things that people were most interested in doing in that first generation of work in the 70s on queer history was just to prove visibility, right? Because people said that gay people really weren't even there. And the 18th century sources are abundant. Mother Clap Smiley House has case after case, incident after incident of queer visibility in the 18th century. And he wrote that up, right? And other scholars followed in his path also too, working in the same project of proving visibility. Roman homosexuality by Craig Williams, Greek homosexuality by Dover, trying to document these areas. The Greek and Roman tradition had been obscured, the degree to which same-sex desire was involved in some of these cultural forms, right? Works have been made to attempt to elide the actual facts. There was a great recovery project that happened in the 70s for some of this. Also too, Michael Roke's Forbidden Friendships, an amazing book. He managed to find a period in Renaissance Florence where for about 40 years, they actually enforced the laws against same-sex desire that were on the books. That was punished only by a fine there. Up to 45% of the men of Florence were brought before the tribunal on charges related to same-sex desire, right? Showing just how prevalent the behavior was in Florence. But you might be able to tell from these titles too, though, that as we amassed more evidence through the 70s, there began to be a problem, right? Because are what the Greeks and the Romans doing, is it really homosexuality, right? Or in Renaissance Florence, because it was very age structured, right? It was mostly about older men pursuing younger men. There was also a sense that people would age out, right? Would marry, have children, right? It wasn't about exclusive same-sex desire. And so the evidence, as we got more of it, didn't really fit the theory of just proving that homosexuals, right, had always existed. And that's why we need theory, right? That's where theory came from, right? That's why works like Foucault's History of Sexuality really kind of remade the field. Because what Foucault said is that the only way we understand our desires are through the cultural texts that we have to interpret them, right? That's how we make sense of the evidence of experience. And so culture can shape, right, perception, right? Institutions within the state, right, have the power to put more sort of coercive, restrictive paradigms, but other cultural texts can also be used to help people understand what they're doing. The reason why we say modern homosexual identity dates from the late 19th century is because the cultural texts that were used for people to form identity around the idea that of an inborn same-sex desire, right, that was exclusive, right, to just members of the same sex, unchanging throughout life, that's really something that develops right in the late 19th century through medical discourses, through legal persecutions and reactions to those to try and create more space for self-expression. So Foucault and theory really grew out of the problem of amassing evidence. John Boswell's work, I think, is great as a marker for when theory really, we can say, sort of took over. He was a great historian of trying to dig up factual evidence, but he was still working within a paradigm of trying to explain it as homosexuality. And by the time that Christianity, social tolerance, and homosexuality came out, most of the profession was sort of moving more towards the theory camp. And so this book was actually kind of critiqued a lot within the academy, where his later book, Same-Sex Unions in Pre-Modern Europe, was vilified by the right, became a hugely controversial book. He found evidence that there were blessings within the church for same-sex couples. It was an outgrowth of the ancient world, right? A recognition of those types of same-sex friendships. He found persistence of this into the Middle Ages. But right-wing conservatives said that he was overstating the evidence, that there was no precedent for this, right? So in a sense, this kind of paradigm really we can see kind of breaking up with Boswell's work. Now, Richter Norton, our alum, continued to work in this way though, right? Because Richter was still committed to the idea of just proving visibility. And in part because the people that he was most interested to document left more records. He has a website now that you can visit. He has just been documenting case after case, putting it up freely available. He lives in London. He's not a professional academic, but he continues to write academic works. Yeah, I'm actually going to have lunch with him in a couple of weeks. So, but this is where that sort of energy, he continued to work in this way, but most of the rest of the field went towards theory. Judith Butler was the next great modification of the Foucauldian paradigm of using cultural text to understand the self, right? Butler, one of her innovations was to say that embodiment does matter, right? In a Foucauldian system of power, right, cultural texts shape how we understand gender as well as sexuality, whereas Butler said that this is true, but the ways in which we are embodied are the filter through which we receive these cultural texts, right? Sort of reinserting the primacy of gendered analysis, right? Also to one of the things that had been said that was sort of distressing about the Foucauldian paradigm was that there was no resistance to power. There was no real outside of power. Butler's formulation actually did put forward a model, right, where through the non-normative performance of gender roles, right, through non-normative reenactments, we can actually kind of like disrupt the power structures that are trying to create us into docile, productive, and reproductive bodies, right? So Butler put forward a more sort of hopeful, more liberationist kind of paradigm that others have applied. So some really great work came out of this initial engagement with theory. George Chauncey's Gay New York, a real landmark for documenting the visibility of queer individuals in the late 19th century forward. Very careful also to talk about how, you know, what's going on, you know, is really kind of in that late 19th century period forward also too, and the ways in which cultural texts are influencing how people think about the self. Martha Vicinas, Intimate Friends, looking at female same-sex desire in the 18th and 19th centuries, and showing how before modern homosexual identity, there are groups of remarkable women who come together, who form community, right, based around same-sex desire, but they use things like family metaphors in order to create community and understand their desires and affections and commitments to each other. Also to ideas like the romantic genius. Many of these women were artists, and taking advantage of the greater cultural space that artists are given to deviate from the norm, to express female same-sex desire. Also too, we got our first landmark work in trans history, Joanne Mierowitz's How Sex Changed, looking at sexual reassignment surgery and how that developed in the course of the 20th century. It was the first time that a major already established scholar did trans history. So this book was a real landmark. But we start to see an issue with this paradigm also too by this point, right? It's because if we think about how Mirowitz is looking at Christine Jorgensen, right? The first trans person to go through sexual reassignment surgery and become a celebrity in Cold War America. Jorgensen, through conforming to a very sort of a traditional sense of femininity, was able to present herself as someone who went through surgery, who was changed by this, and was accepted largely within the culture. It also had a lot to do with Cold War politics and the idea of, right, science can overcome all social problems that was so prevalent in the 50s. It was the atomic age. It seemed like anything might be possible. So Jorgensen's story is wonderfully documented by Mirowitz, and Mirowitz wanted to include people of color. But what Mirowitz did then was look for the first person of color that went through this predetermined system, right, that Jorgensen had set up, and found one individual, right, the first individual person of color to go through sexual reassignment surgery. But then that person, you know, came later in the story, and in many ways was a lesser version of the Jorgensen story. Certainly did it with less cultural resources, less financial resources. Mirowitz said, you know, I wanted to include more, but there was simply nothing there. There was not more evidence there, right? It's a little less forgivable with George Chauncey, right? Because George Chauncey in Gay New York, there's a line that I remember reading in the 90s when this book came out, where he says that there was actually a larger queer community in Harlem. The largest queer community in New York was in Harlem. And then he goes back to talking about Greenwich Village for the whole rest of the book, right? So acknowledging that people of color were the majority, and yet focusing on the white community for most of this story, most of this work. You know, why aren't these Black men on the cover of Gay New York? Now, not all books in this period had that sort of blind spot when it came to race, right? Some books like John Howard's Men Like That, A Southern Queer History, and in part because white supremacy and the Jim Crow South is so prevalent in his story, race is much more of a central feature. This is also part of our paradigm when thinking about FSU's queer history as the first great landmark work of queer history of the Southern United States. And so one of the things that Howard found was that the South actually had a lot of space for men like that, for the queer uncle who never married, who was still accepted within the family, and various different forms of female same-sex desire that were accepted as well too. When the South becomes deeply homophobic is when queers use their power and privilege, especially white queer men, to try and help the civil rights movement, right? Then it's a threat to the power structure. And it's then that their queerness becomes a target, right? Wonderfully documented throughout the late 19th and into the 20th century, how it's that interaction between civil rights activism and threatening the power structure that brings on these forms. Also to the demonizing of civil rights workers coming to the South and disparaging their sexuality as well too, and queer baiting them, right? So, but the book that really kind of just changed everything for thinking about race and same-sex desire. Now, C. Riley Snorton's Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. It's an amazing book. And there are other scholars that are working within the sort of field of Blackness as a way to analyze culture. But Snorton just knocked it out of the park with this book. And it really is the next step in the evolution of the Foucault, Butler, and now Snorton paradigm. Because what Snorton said is that for people, within the field of Blackness, right, for people who are defined by that cultural trope, you know, then it is defined by slavery, right? It is defined by violence. It is defined by terror. It is defined by a state that is not trying to build up the humanity of these people through institutions, right, like schools and churches and other things, but about trying to tear down their humanity, right? The forms of racial oppression are about effeminizing Black men. They're about masculinizing Black women. They're about denying them sort of the cultural appropriations of normative gender in order to help to control, right, those populations. And so what Snorton said is that within Blackness, if gender is operating so differently, why should we expect trans to operate in the same way, And so the book is a tour de force. Now, Norton had almost no conventional sources to go with for the early parts of this story, but used theory to extrapolate what can we say about the experience of Blackness and the experience of trans using what we have, right? And starts at the very beginnings of Black culture in America, of Blackness in America within enslavement, takes it to the present. And it is a wonderful, right, rethinking of so many issues, not just looking at people who define themselves as trans within the Black community, but because how gender operated differently within Blackness, right? How ideas of transness and fungibility are within Black culture, right, in general, right? Okay, now we're to Florida, right? Because Julio Capo has written the definitive book on how to think about queerness in Florida. Welcome to Fairyland. It just came out a few years ago, and he is the inheritor of all these traditions. And he takes race so seriously and puts it so centrally in the way that Norton did as well too. So how can we think about what is unique about the context of queerness within Florida and within Miami? What does Capo do? Well, one of the fields that he says we should think about is, first off, Florida is a frontier, right? As much as a frontier as the West was at that time. It's in the Caribbean. It bounds other cultures with different laws and different norms, right? And that this has to be a part of it. It's also, right, within the tropics, and it's also, right, this kind of place apart from the rest of America. In many ways, Florida was always kind of the other of America. And it was always meant to be the exotic. Miami was only founded in the 1890s. There was no industry in Miami. There was nothing but tourism, right? It was built from scratch, specifically to be a place that had to attract tourism, that had to attract people to come for, right, pleasurable purposes, pitched itself as a fantasy land, right? These backgrounds, right? These fake backgrounds you were invited to pose in front of, right? Your imagined tropical transformation, right? These were around Miami and Miami Beach in the early 20th century, right? This is a place where the rest of the country was invited, right? Heterosexuals, especially, primarily, to come to reinvent yourself, to relax where the normal rules didn't apply. And you were supposed to send these messages back to the rest of the country that this was a place apart. Now, this is about queer individuals, but it's also about all individuals, because you can't understand homosexuality or same-sex desire or queerness or trans without understanding heterosexuality and the versions of heterosexuality that surrounded it. There's a whole chapter in Capo's book about heterosexual white women and how they can reinvent themselves in this sort of fantasy space of Florida. And what that gives to queer people, right? When you shift what the norm is to this degree. Now, that is because queer visibility in Florida is all about maintaining this tourist space, this transformative space, this space where you can be something else. The Chamber of Commerce and the power structure has to embrace this, because this is what people come to Florida for. Now, notice this amazing image on the left. This is a heterosexual man being like tossed out by a bouncer. But notice the bouncer with the limp wrist, right? He's a queer. Most everybody who manned the bars were queer or other in some sense, right? Or these sort of liminal spaces. They were people of color, they were queer. They were the ones that were part of the exotic show that you came to see, right? If you were a tourist in these areas. Also too, if you're a heterosexual person bringing your date to one of these places, right? It would put you in this sort of erotic charged atmosphere, but you could also have your masculinity shored up in contrast, right, to the queer performers or the queer staff that manned these spaces, right? This is all part of Miami. Now, one of the great things, though, what Capo does is he doesn't just stop with sexuality, right? Because he thinks about what else are bodies used for? And he thinks about labor. And he thinks about how labor is experienced differentially for white bodies and Black bodies. And also, too, not just Black bodies within like the context of the Southern United States, but especially Black Bahamian men who were brought over as a form of contract laborer or laborers who had no documentation, who could be exploited in different ways. And he investigates and interrogates their experience also too within this, right? Because part of what you were buying when you came to Miami was this fantasy, not only sort of sexual transgression, but of power and of racial power, right? Images like this, where, as Capo says, as the forms of white supremacy were slipping, right, in some ways within the country, you could still come down here and have, for a price, these reenactments of subservience that shore up ideas of white supremacy and the white self, through these performances of hospitality, right, in Miami, right, Florida in general, but especially Miami. So we see Black bodies within this context being used to serve up, right, food and pleasure, right, the commodification and consumption of Black bodies, or Black bodies being used as props, right, to build up a certain vision of whiteness and white power, right? So Capo tells us this complicated story of what Florida was that has all of these issues of greater visibility for queers within the commercial culture because they were so necessary and there was no other industry, but also these themes of oppression and violence, right? They're all still there. But in the midst of it, there is still this sort of beauty and this transgression of the systems of oppression, right? These are images that John Singer Sargent, the American famous artist, did of Black Bahamian men in Miami, right? He would come down, he would paint watercolors. He was a queer man. He came to these spaces, and while he was definitely sort of taking advantage of his privileged access to, right, these Black queer men or these Black bodies through his economic power, right, through his whiteness, there is still, nevertheless, right, in these images, we can see a connection, right? A connection of just queer men, right? Of compassion, of dignity, right? This is a watercolor that Sargent did of another man. This is a Narcissus image. This is a classic image from the Western tradition of queerness, right? Of the young man from the ancient world who fell in love with his own image, right? Very queer in that sense. But to depict it as a Black man in the classical nude, right? With the dignity and the affection and the compassion, right? One of the amazing things that what Capo shows us, right, in his approach and contextualization, is he doesn't talk about these individuals as somehow being able to break through or escape out of these systems of oppression that they lived within. But even in the midst of all of that, taking advantage of the space around tourism, around the margins, where they could have dignity and pleasure and queerness and connection, right? It's just sort of a beautiful way to think about it. And it is a very honest way to think about it. And it's a very accurate way to think about it, right? And so all of this is going on, right, in the queer history of Miami. And it's not just one artist and their models, right? This is how America in general thought of Florida. If you get the chance, this is an amazing film. I don't know if anybody's seen it, A Florida Enchantment. It's a black and white silent film. Now be warned, it's from 1914, so there are blackface characters in this if you decide to watch it. But it's a story. These two individuals on the right are a couple. They're engaged. They have a little bit of a problem. One of them travels to Florida and in this sort of tropical transformative climate, and she eats a magical tropical seed. And from the moment that she does, she becomes completely uninterested in her fiance, and she becomes very interested in women. And she is very successful with women, right? And the ways in which she rebuffs her fiance are wonderfully comic, and you can't believe that this is in a 1914 film, right? In the sort of Florida hotel, right? Resort hotel. Here we see her at a big party. She's stolen the girlfriend from another man. The men are trying to break in. Later in the film, right? She begins to, right, fully transition, and women flock to her even more so, right? She begins to set up an entirely new life as a man. Her fiance, in desperation, eats one of the seeds himself, but then he becomes attracted to men, and he starts dressing as a woman. He almost gets killed. His flirtations are not received in the same positive way, right? Same-sex desire has very different connotations when expressed by a man versus expressed by a woman. But nevertheless, right, this kind of idea that Florida is somewhere where the normal rules don't apply. This incredible gender-bending trans sort of story that is very inclusive in so many ways, was there in 1914, right? Just a few decades after Miami itself was founded. And we see these same themes, right? Decades later in Some Like It Hot, Marilyn Monroe's best film. If you've never seen it, see it like as soon as you can, right? Because of course it's about two men cross-dressing to hide from the mob, but it's also has queer individuals, queer characters that are sympathetically portrayed throughout the film. I won't give it away, but these are the kind of associations, right, that Florida had. It was always transgressive. It was always something like a little bit different. Now, the queer history of Florida didn't have to be written so progressively. This is a good book in many ways, but it doesn't put race as central or labor as central as Capo does. And so in many ways, it just doesn't sort of have the same emotional resonance, right, as Capo's book does. So, okay, now we're finally to part two. If we, about thinking about how can we apply all of these to doing the queer history of Florida State. How can we do that sort of radical contextualization that Julio Capo has shown us can be so powerful in helping to include everybody's story into the story of queerness? But couple that also too with our alum, Richter Norton, and his dedication to try and find every piece of evidence that he can, right? And using theory to help to bridge the gap between those, right? So what would be the elements of the queer history of Florida? Well, one big piece would be about the Johns Committee, right? There's been a lot of work done on this. This was in the 1950s during the Red Scare. There was a committee set up in the Florida legislature to try and it persecuted queers on campus at FSU to go after queer faculty, to go after queer students, to hold them before secret tribunals, to hold them sometimes for more than a day in isolation, to try and run them out of town, run them off of campus. Really hardcore Red Scare, right, tactics, McCarthy era tactics. Okay, but we can't study that without bringing in FAMU. We can't do the queer history of that on campus without thinking about FAMU, because the committee was originally founded to root out communists, i.e. civil rights workers, from the FAMU campus. And they couldn't find enough to justify the level of activity they wanted from the committee. So they expanded it from just policing Black bodies to policing queers at the FSU campus. So any queer history of FSU needs to bring FAMU in, and it needs to think about state power and coercion and Cold War culture. Now, if you want a lot of details on this, there's a great video that was made, documentary. It's about 30 minutes long. Take a quick screenshot, and then you can download that and see it. Highly recommended it. It's super good. Tell you what, I will take a sip while you're taking your screenshots. Okay, and we would also have to think about things like this. No, I will not get in trouble from the Florida legislature by putting these images up, because these images were published by the Florida legislature. Part of the Johns Committee work was about teaching good citizens how to recognize queers. And so they published this pamphlet, among other things, Homosexuality and Citizenship in Florida, right? But this was part of the overreach of the committee, though. This is part of what helped to create the backlash against it, because they said they were publishing this to help good citizens be able to root out queers. Other people said that by doing this, you're simply sort of spreading this type of information, right? The Johns Committee kind of imploded shortly after this as it tried to do more and more sensational things, right, to keep itself relevant. This cartoon kind of sums up the collapse of the Johns Committee and the public support for it. Notice this isn't a pro-queer cartoon. This is still the 1960s. But what is being mocked here is governmental overreach and governmental ineptitude. Right here we have the spy, approaching the student saying, we hear there have been some heterosexuals loose around here, right? Completely misreading the situation, getting it wrong. The student's just rolling his eyes at this ineffectual state official. And this sort of is part of what leads to the backlash. Karen Graves wrote a wonderful book about the implications of this for Florida teachers. This also intersects with the FSU campus. We would draw on her research to help to build out the FSU side of this story as well too. We brought her to campus last year. She gave a great talk specifically on these aspects of the Johns Committee that her research works on. Also too, David K. Johnson, he is another Florida historian, Florida system historian. He wrote about the broader context of the Red Scare as it applied to queers and the Lavender Scare. So in order to understand what goes on our campus, we would want to read his book. And that is a documentary that was made about his book that you can get on Netflix, I believe. It's also very good to sort of help to understand that a little better. Now, as we move into the 70s, right, another big queer event on campus was started by Hiram Ruiz, right? Person of color, Latinx individual who was the person to found the first Gay Liberation Front movement in the Southern United States, right here on the FSU campus. At the same time, Richter Norton was here and was active. That group only lasted for a couple of years, but if we read something like Mark Stein's Rethinking the Gay and Lesbian Movement, we'll understand why, right? Because Gay Liberation Fronts were the most radical version of queer culture. It wasn't assimilationist, it was confrontational. And those groups were powerful in trying to change the dynamic all over the country. Hiram Ruiz reached out to the National Organization for Women in Tallahassee. He reached out to the local Malcolm X Society, forming alliances of gender, right, and race and sexuality. But it kind of burned itself out. But we don't have to necessarily feel bad about that because that's just the nature of these more radical groups. That's part of the queer history of FSU. Now, also too, we would want to look at the groups that were of greater longevity, right? There was a real strong tradition of peer counseling in the 70s on the FSU campus, run by the FSU Mental Health Center. And that involved both people on campus as well as queers from the community who were invited to come in and participate. All of the records of all of these different groups are now housed in the special collections collection of Strozer Library. And again, if you want to take a screenshot on this, then you can find it pretty quickly in the library collection. It helps to document the institutional history of all the different groups that led to today's Pride Student Union, right? So this institutional gathering of information would be a part of any FSU queer history, as well as what's going on in the community, because the Family Tree Community Center, very active for a very long time, had strong connections to the campus community, right? So we can't just look at only FSU. We have to think about how FSU is interacting with the broader community. And the international community too, because one amazing bit of FSU's queer history is the fact that the largest lesbian publisher in the world, right, was based out of Tallahassee for more than 2 decades. Now, again, this is something that the Queer Oral History Project is doing a lot of work on. There's going to be a museum exhibition on this, I believe in about a year, right? So that's going to be amazing and a great place to go for this. Nyad Press was founded by Barbara Greer and Donna McBride in 1973. It was devoted exclusively to lesbian literature. It plowed the profits from one book into helping cultivate other lesbian authors. Bookstores wouldn't touch a lot of these titles early on. So they used the mailing list of the premier lesbian organization in the country, the Daughters of Bilitis, to contact individuals to buy these books. And since there weren't bookstores, they helped to cultivate them and to start lesbian bookstores around the country and feminist bookstores. In fact, one of those, Ruby Fruit Books, was founded right across from the FSU campus. This is a picture of Joan Denman. She still lives here in Tallahassee. She is an amazing individual who worked with Barbara Greer and Donna McBride. She may be with us today. We'll have to check in a minute listening to the talk. But she founded Ruby Fruit Books. right, and was a part of this movement. And again, for decades, this was the largest lesbian publisher in the world, based right here at FSU, evolved into 2002 into Bella Books, right? So this is a part of the queer history of Florida and Florida State University. There's another element that this story that's coming into focus now. We have major oral history projects going on. One here on campus, the North Florida Oral History Project. One at University of Florida, which is looking at and documenting queer history overall, collecting these oral histories while people are still alive in living memory. This is very important work. Now, I put Joan Scott's The Fantasy of Feminist History up here as a good book to kind of contextualize this type of gathering, because what Joan Scott said is that women's history and feminism went through a similar phase in the 70s, right? The first phase of feminist literature in the 70s was just about documenting that women were important politically, socially, economically, in all facets of culture, right? And a lot of work, that early feminist work in the academy was really important in documenting all of that evidence. But Scott, says feminism transitioned to theory in the 80s also too, because there was a sense of, we've got all these individual stories, but what do they add up to? What are the overarching structures that are giving them more meaning? Don't we have to dig deeper than beyond just people's personal experience to see the things that are shaping that experience that they themselves might not even be aware of? So with those types of ideas in mind, if I were writing the queer history of FSU, I would not only want to interrogate that wonderful period when it was a women's only college, and the all-female dances and the social structures that were set up on a campus exclusively for women, but I would also want to investigate, why did the state legislature have the women's college in the same town as the HCBU, the historically African-American university, right? Putting white women and Black men in such close proximity to each other. Now, even if it wasn't done initially to increase the remit for policing Black bodies, I would want to go into the Tallahassee Police Department archives and look and see, did Tallahassee police officers, how did they police that boundary, right, between the white women and the Black men in the capital of Florida, right? Did the Tallahassee Police Department use that sort of open-ended mandate in the Jim Crow South, right, to intervene more on the FAMU campus than they would have otherwise, right? I think this is a type of question that would have to be investigated to do a truly complete queer history of FSU, right? Because that influences race and gender and sexuality, but also too, what about class? I mean, can you really do a queer history of FSU and not also think about the relationship between it and FAMU and TCC? That segregation by class, right, of the community college. What does that do to affect the culture and the mindset in these different areas, right? The railroad tracks famously separate FAMU and FSU. When I first came here, only like 20 years ago, that was in no man's land, right? That property has now been developed into what Game Street is today. But why was that neglected for so long? And also too, I'd really want to look at the reconstruction of Tennessee Street, because Tennessee Street is such a barrier between Frenchtown and campus, right? What were the politics of the creation of that reified boundary, right? In the same way of the train tracks separating the women's college from the historically Black college, but again, the policing powers that this might have led to. Now, I would also want to think about religion in our region and how it intersects with campus culture. Certainly there were national stories that had a particularly Florida flavor with the Anita Bryant, right, Save Our Children from Homosexuality campaign in the 70s. But we also had some real religious controversies that rocked our local community, that touch on homophobia, that impacted on campus. I don't know if any of you guys were around here for this, but in 2003, right, Eric Dudley was the pastor of the local Episcopal Church, and he took a massive stand when the Episcopal Church ordained its first openly gay bishop. He said that heresy was running rampant in the church. He broke and shattered the local Anglican community, took a huge chunk of the congregation away, founded a new church which within a few years, right, he was actually forced to step down from the head of, because he was using his position in that church to sexually assault men under his care, right? Men who were in the leadership. He would try and ingratiate himself to them. He would isolate them, and he would make sexual advances on them, right? This person whose homophobia, right, his inability to sort of come to terms with his own desires in an honest way, created this massive rupture for so many good people, right, within our community around queerness, right? That had huge ramifications throughout the town, on campus. That would have to be in the queer history of FSU. Also, too, no queer history of FSU would be complete without interrogating this engine of normative heterosexuality that is the FSU football team, right? Because when we think about cultural history and we think about culture shaping the way we understand desire and ourselves, that's what we should apply to the football team as well, too, right? Because think about it. What does the stadium do? But it takes a group of people, right? And treats them radically different from everyone else. It feeds them differently, it trains them differently, it gives them a radically different college experience. Also, they can go out and perform these natural masculine qualities of athleticism and sport, even though they've been getting a massive degree of unnatural training and attention so that they can do this naturally, right? It's also highly dichotomous in the roles for men and the roles for women, right? A certain ideal of masculinity is put forward, a certain ideal of femininity is put forward. And for those men who may not reach that ideal totally, right, by buying into the culture, right, then you can sort of connect onto that more sort of dominant form of masculinity. And therefore, also too, whatever desires you might have, right, whatever any of these gentlemen who have painted their bodies might like end up doing with each other, right, privately, that doesn't have to affect your identity, right, because your identity is so anchored in this sort of heterosexual masculinist culture. And so that, right, this is a way, but this is the story of gender and sexuality and queerness too, right? This kind of way of sublimating desire, right, and masking desire. Right, and apologies for those of you who are football fans too. It is possible to be queer and a football fan, I understand. But nevertheless, this is the type of thing that I would want to think about. I would love to have a chapter in the queer history of FSU where I juxtapose the football stadium with the Mickey Faust Club that's at the other end of Gaines Street. The Mickey Faust Club is an incredible cabaret that's been in Railroad Square for 30 years. That is incredibly inclusive around gender and sexuality and race, but also ability. I have never seen a cabaret troupe so successfully integrate people with disabilities of varying degrees of ability into the mainstream of the cast and the program as the Mickey Faust Club does, right? And to think about that contrast, right, between you know, all of the variety of bodies and non-normative genders in the Mickey Faust Club, right, and the football stadium that celebrates a very sort of like ableist type of ideal, right? You know, putting those two in dialogue with each other, not necessarily to, you know, like disparage one too much, right? But just to kind of like, you know, interrogate that and sort of talk about the cultures that are created and the work that that does. That would need to be a part of that. We could not do the queer history of FSU without taking into our phenomenal, right, drag culture, right, trans community performers. The local Miss Tallahassee pageants are amazing, right? These are longstanding. This would need to be thoroughly investigated and integrated into this story. I know I'm going a bit long, so I don't have time to talk about this. This slide is just about all the paradigms for interpretation like Norton that are just getting established. This is going to be the definitive defining book on Two-Spirit. It hasn't been written yet. This is going to come out in just a few months. But this is really going to change how we think about gender and sexuality in sort of Native American communities, I think. And so again, some of these paradigms that we will need to do the best analysis are only just coming together. So you may be saying, okay, why am I just doing all this academic hand-wringing, right? Why don't I just give you the queer history of FSU instead of telling you this is how it should be done, right? Well, that's because I am, you know, a queer historian, but I'm also a British historian. I do write books where I take much more, you know, a much more definitive stance on a lot of these things. But these are my books where I've done that. And I spent about 10 years researching each one, right? I was asked to do this talk just a few weeks ago. I may turn this talk into a book because there's a lot of great material here. But one of the things that you learn as far as theory and methodology of queer history is that you don't treat other people's stories lightly. I wouldn't want to come in with only 2 weeks worth of research to try, and after thinking about all the different communities that a queer history of FSU would really need to incorporate, I would want to look at those thoroughly. I would want to really research those and integrate those. So I didn't give short shrift to anyone's story. So I don't privilege the stories that I know best and not maybe put more in about those that would be harder to research. That's how you use theory, and queer theory is keeping me from giving you a polished surface from this talk, showing you that this is a work in progress because nobody has written the book on the queer history of FSU. We've gathered a lot of the pieces, right? We can do that project now. We've done the best of what Richter Norton has said about trying to gather the evidence, the oral histories, the archives, right? And we need to think about, right, then applying those methodologies like Capo does to write the best story, right? And the last piece that we would want to include in this, taking us back to Joan Scott and the fantasy of feminist history, another thing that that book talked about was the sort of the angst in feminism to some degree in the early 21st century that many feminists felt. This idea was that feminism and feminist theory had been so vital and so powerful in the late 80s and 90s. It felt like it was transforming the world, because it really was. It was giving the academy a new way to think about the self and subjectivity that was more powerful than anything that was there before. I really think feminist theory is the great sort of advance in philosophy of our age. And that type of work just wasn't really being produced anymore in the early 21st century. And one of the things Joan Scott got us to think about was to say that, well, that's because that cutting edge of critique was about creating social change. It felt like we were changing the world because we were, and that's what made it powerful. And if we're not, it's not working the same way in women's history and feminist history now, it's in part because those most important struggles have kind of been won and fought, right? At least in certain key theoretical ways. And if we want to hold on to that passion and that energy, then we have to follow the cutting edge of critique, right? Where is theory and critique needed most? Where is it doing the most social work? And she said, you know, it's sort of as it can shift towards queer, towards trans, but it's also very much in Black Lives Matter, right? This book was written before Black Lives Matter, but saying that it's this critique of race and power. That's where it's most needed. That's where the vital core is. So any queer history of FSU would also really want to foreground, right, those issues of Blackness and transformation and culture, right, that should be at the heart, right? Because this story, right, is always about race, and it's always about power, and it's always about how the local intersects with the national and the international, and it's always about trying to tell everybody's story as completely as possible and being humble about what you don't know, but being very sort of right upfront about what you do and what you can for and fighting for what you think is right. And any queer history of FSU would have to have that right at the center. Okay, and that's the end of the talk, right? That's where I think we should end. I hope that there is some material in there that is going to spark some questions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much, Dr. Upchurch, for such a fascinating, enlightening talk. I did not know that there was that much deeply rooted queer history in FSU and in Tallahassee as well. That's totally something I would not expect. So this is the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, leave them in the chat and I'll be moderating the discussion.
Well, you know, maybe to warm us up too, maybe I might ask a question of the audience, because, you know, it really was that question that will there be people of color in this talk? I could totally see where that came from, right? Because so many books were written that left people of color out of the queer narrative. And so I really kind of wanted to foreground the theory as a way to show, how that can be addressed. I mean, did people like the balance that I struck in this about having, having theory about the history of the writing of queer history as a preface? I mean, it took a long time to sort of get to FSU, but I think it sort of helped to really show the stakes of not just taking a recounting of facts as the best version of what we could do. Did that work for folks? Did people, I'd love to hear anybody's thought on that. I mean, I did explain Judith Butler and Foucault in like about 30 seconds each, so I'm not even sure how much of that, what people got out of that. But I think, theory, as I said in one of the paragraphs about this, it's not about making things obscure. Theory really helps us see what's already there, right? And I really think academics could do a better job of being able to explain the insights of theory in ways that people who don't have the luxury of spending their entire career to master these texts can understand, because it is doing understandable, clear work, and we just need to sort of explain it a little bit to people and to let them see the value of it. So I have a hard time reading the chat while I'm talking too, because I don't want to take my eyes off the screen. So if anybody wants to summarize some things that have been sent into the chat, even if they're not your comments, that might help to sort of, get us going more interactive here.
For sure. People are just applauding your talk. Everyone seems to really enjoyed it, and so have I. I actually have a question, and I guess I can get the ball rolling. So in terms of the current state of Tallahassee and FSU, there has been a lot of contention on campus, especially between Pride and Greek life. And in general, with the No Say Gay bill, I personally don't even have kind of the brain bandwidth to even process that. But I guess my question is, how would you advise Pride leaders, as well as Pride Student Union and queer students on campus, to be a voice and an agent for change in Tallahassee and on FSU's campus in kind of a heightened, challenged time? And how do you think like queer theory and just the queer history in Tallahassee as well can be used as a tool to help us combat all of the negativity and homophobia going on right now? Sorry, that was kind of long-winded.
That is such a great question, and such an important one also too. I think one thing you can do is exactly what you're doing now, right? Is to be out there, right? And be visible, right? Hold a number of events. Don't let them sort of push you out of public space, right? Is really important. I think also too, using theory to help to reinforce the ways in which, all of these forms of oppression are interconnected. Right? I mean, much in the same way that the Johns Committee went after queers, as a way to sort of expand its open-ended remit to police bodies, right? Originally it targeted African-American civil rights workers. Current political controversies are a lot about state politics and creating division and wedge issues. And so we should understand that it's coming from that type of political place. And I think we should work to redouble our alliances, right, with all the groups on campus that are sympathetic. Student groups, people of color, the various different groups on campus, right? Alliances with FAMU, alliance with feminist organizations, because it's all part of the same struggle, right? I mean, the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program had a huge controversy where outside groups targeted one of the classes in women's studies, right? That tried, it was called the History of Karen. And what it looked at was the history of the way in which sort of the protection of white women was used in the racial politics of the South and America. Outside groups were able to sort of pounce on and get that course canceled. Unfortunately, women's studies wasn't able to fight and prevent that, in part because death threats were being made by these outside groups. Yes. And against individuals. It was felt for the safety of the students and the faculty that this, sort of should not necessarily be go on this, that their safety could not be justified. But the WGSS has had multiple meetings about this to talk about how we can organize and be prepared for the next one, and to sort of come up with our statement of principles about academic freedom, and so that when the next struggle like this happens, we'll be better prepared, right? Because outside groups do not set the curriculum of our university, right? And we need to be able to be organized and prepare for that pressure. It'd be nice to say that we could always be able to defeat this at every time, but we weren't expecting that type of issue to come up. So I would just say, use theory to understand, the nature of these attacks, right? How they serve a larger political purpose, and to shore up organizational connections with other groups sympathetic on campus, with faculty who are sympathetic, right? And to keep visible in public space, right? Don't cede that ground. So great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a very articulate answer. Thank you so much. We have another question in the chat that I will read from Michael. If this were to become a book project, what opportunities do you see for collaboration with both Black and LGBTQ+ communities in Tallahassee outside of the existing oral history accounts? Do you think that it is vital that those communities become active? Sorry, I'm trying to, okay. Do you think that it is vital that those communities become active participants in the creation of that scholarship?
Absolutely, yes. And in fact, as I was thinking about this project, it could potentially lend itself to something like, designing a course. I've often sort of toyed with the idea of teaching a class for undergrads where the semester-long project is to write an article that's published, right? We collectively as a class, to let undergraduates see what I do as a professional historian, right, is to run the class in that way. And I was thinking about ways in which this could become a larger collaborative project, right? The Queer History of Tallahassee, sort of written by students, of FSU, written by students, incorporating it into, research projects. There's a strong support on campus for undergraduate research initiatives. I've done a lot with UROP students, and thinking about kind of creating, there's a tradition in British history that I'm kind of like latching onto with this too. It was called the History Workshop Journal. There were some guys, it was the socialists, like the New Left Marxists, right, who broke with the Communist Party after the invasion of Hungary in 1956, who really kind of tried to put a stamp on how can we be academic, but really like not lose our connections to the workers, right? When labor history was the cutting edge of critique. And it was labor historians who first made space in the Academy for women's historians and for people of color as well too. So, it's a long tradition. And one of the things that the History Workshop Journal, some remarkable scholars did, is that they kind of, they created these collaboratives so that actual manual laborers could study, right, in academic work, could write and produce academic work, would collectively author academic work. Raphael Samuel wrote some amazing work. He didn't publish as much in his own name because he was really kind of committed to this type of collaborative research. And as a way to get multiple voices in, right? Thinking about the ways that we could use sort of crowdsourcing and academic research and undergraduate credit for academic research, graduate credit for academic research, the scholarship and practice course that FSU students have to take. Wouldn't this be a great anchor for a scholarship and practice course where, we would collectively work on researching different parts of this book over the course of multiple semesters, right? So that, I think that as a way to pull in multiple voices, yes, absolutely. And so I don't know, I'm thinking off the top of my head. I'll stop that now because you get the picture, but there are a lot of ways for this book to be written. And I think that doing some in ways that were collaborative and would bring in multiple authors and multiple voices would be very much in the spirit of a certain type of queer history and a certain type of New Left social history, both traditions which I'm trained in and very much appreciate.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. This comes from Ryan Hurst. How do you think we can apply the historical context of queer history in Florida with modern day struggles for the queer community in Florida, particularly in terms of public policy?
Wow. That's such a big question. And I'm not even sure if I want to, how much I can say, just because it's so important that in a sense, it's somewhat out of my field. I mean, one of the reasons why I like history is that I've often found that by dealing with issues in the historical context, often even in the British historical context, it's a remove or two away so that people can explore ideas and positions that definitely were not their own in a way that kind of divorces it from the more sort of emotional issues that we have with our own contemporary politics. And it sort of helps us to gain greater empathy, greater insights, greater understanding, by cultivating that remove. I mean, I often look for issues and controversies in the past, in British history and LGBTQ history, that we can kind of work through that do have a resonance with what's going on today. I mean, within the contemporary world of politics and how we could apply these insights to our own political struggles. I mean, I think that, well, I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways that we would need to, history more broadly. In a lot of ways, it feels like we're at a potential, and in some ways a dangerous moment, but in some ways a really hopeful moment, right? Where, I mean, I think about, I'm from Wilmington, North Carolina, that had some of the most multiracial governments in the American South after the Civil War. And then we had a coup, basically, where white supremacists overthrew the government of my hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina, specifically because people of color were becoming so prominent within the government, right? And in North Carolina as well, too, the people of color were purged from the legislature in an illegal coup. I mean, there's no other word for it. I mean, shades of January 6th, right? What might have happened if there weren't those incredible police officers, right, who did such a phenomenal job to defend our democracy. Those people weren't there back then. I mean, in a sense, though, it feels like that it's so dangerous. The forces of reaction that are pushing against us are so strong right now, is because in some ways we are potentially that close to winning, right? I mean, I think that we have got such a broad coalition right now of people who are sympathetic, of people who have been woken up to, the violence that's been inflicted on Black communities by the police, right? Black Lives Matter has been transformative, right? I think that we have a far more genuine coalition across, LGBTQ and feminist and people of color in a way that I don't think, I've ever experienced in my lifetime. And I think the potential power of that is one of the things that scares the people who attempted to overthrow the US government on January 6th and subvert the election. And so I think that if we can keep organized and if we can keep together, right, and can keep focused, and maybe understand the stakes, right? Because on the one hand, it's very scary, but that's in part because we do have so much potential, right? We do have potential to, to cement all of these gains that we've made, or we could potentially lose them, like happened when the coups were successful, right, in North Carolina and Wilmington at the very end of the 19th century, right? So maybe that will help us to redouble our efforts to make sure that this time, we win, right? And that all of these gains that we're putting together that are scaring so many people, right, aren't washed away, because we are on the side of the Constitution, right? The laws are on our side, right? We have worked through the system to gain greater legal protections. And now it's our job to be good Americans and defend the system, right, that is offering greater conclusion, right, for us, right, to defend the laws and defend the institutions and not allow someone to illegally overthrow elections, right? I mean, so yes, the stakes have absolutely never been higher, I think, right now. But I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful and vigilant and active. So, okay, I think I'm going to end there, right? But thank you for the question. So.
Thank you.
All right. Okay.
Dr. Upchurch, wow. That was phenomenal. That was enlightening. That was educational. From the bottom of my heart, it was an honor to have you with our Pride Night series. Sir, thank you so much for what you do, what you have done, and what you continue to do to fight for our rights and being vigilant and active, not only in the community, but Tallahassee as a whole, and of course, Florida State University. So thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed the conversation and being able to share with you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir. Everybody, thank you for coming tonight. We've enjoyed having you. If you want to be involved with the Pride Alumni Network, please fill out the forms that were put in the chat link. We'd love to have you involved and continue paving the path to be part of queer history at Florida State, because without you, we have no history. You, in the present moment, are creating history by being here, and we couldn't do this without all of your support. So I thank you for supporting us. I thank you for having our backs. I thank the Alumni Association for giving us a seat at the table and allowing us to have a wonderful and engaging evening like this, and just being there for everybody. And so with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful, safe night. Stay healthy, and in Seminole Pride, go Noles.